Is this graph how game dev feels for you? How can we instead sustain motivation as a game dev? In this video, I'll show you 3 goals to strive for that can take your motivation from this to this. I first came up with these strategies during my year-long master's degree research, where I looked not only at design strategies, but also how to teach those strategies. And in addition to the research, I also created self-study online modules and then used that to teach people design strategies. I had people go through the modules and I read every response from everyone, collected all the data, and saw how it could be improved. And after all that, now I want to share what I learned with you. The 3 design goals that I'll go through in this video focus on 3 critical aspects of game development: iteration, feedback, and organization. We'll talk about those 3 areas and how you can use them to boost your motivation and sustain it. One last thing before we start. This video will serve as an overview of all the strategies that I'm going to talk about, so it won't go into extreme detail in some areas. I'll make more videos in the future on project planning, but for now, I'll include in the description lots of resources both for these 3 strategies and other things that have helped me along the way. And in the description, I'll include an infographic that reminds you of all the points I'm going to make in this video. You can use it as a reference guide and download it for free, and then use it in your development. Goal 1 is iteration. The goal of iteration is concerned with your ability to identify a minimum viable product for your game, and then use that idea to guide your efforts in your development. Take a look at this picture by Henrik Nyberg. It summarizes the idea of minimum viable products well. Instead of creating a game in separate pieces that come together as if there's some sort of imaginary blueprint for a game, this picture instead suggests that we create a working version, in the case of a game something that can be completed, as quickly as possible, and then we iterate on it, get feedback, so that it actually adapts to what the player wants, instead of becoming so rigid and defined. And although some things can be created in a rigid, separate way, games are way too dynamic and changing for that to really work in most cases. So the first step to achieving the goal of iteration is to be able to identify minimum viable game designs. The best way to improve at identifying and creating minimum viable game designs is through practice. Game jams work really well for this. I'd specifically like to recommend the 1-hour game jam. It works especially well for this. I'll include a link in the description. And the reason I recommend this jam specifically is because it's only an hour long, which really forces you to figure out what is the minimum viable product here. And another reason I recommend the jam is because I know the person who runs it personally. I know you're not going to be made to feel bad, no matter how your game turns out, or if you even don't want to submit it. Identifying and creating minimum viable games is a great way to get an amazing starting point for your game. But most people struggle to sustain motivation, not have it in the beginning of a project. So there's actually more to the goal of iteration than just knowing how to prototype. Developers that sustain motivation not only can identify minimum viable game designs, but they have a practice at identifying what tasks relate to the game design and the core concepts and what tasks don't. And they leverage both types of tasks to sustain their motivation. If you ask most people how to start making a game, they'll say, make a prototype, make something that works, and iterate on it. But the advice kind of ends there. I want to bring your attention to this perspective I found on Rigor Mortis Tortoise's YouTube channel.
I've said it once and I'll say it again, game development is a labor of love. It is so tempting to try and think about the most efficient way to do things because that makes logical sense. But when you have an overwhelming task in front of you, it makes more sense to just prioritize what brings you the most joy.
At first glance, the idea of prioritizing joy in game development over progress is pretty contrary to the idea of a minimum viable game. And taken to the extreme, it's a pretty bad idea. However, I think there is a balance somewhere in the middle here. If we spend too much time working only on the game design and the core elements, we risk killing our motivation actually. What happens when we get really stuck on a problem and need some time to think about it? What happens when we're getting overwhelmed by bug fixes and little problems that are driving us crazy? Development is going to start to feel like a chore pretty fast if we're only focusing on one element of the game until there's a complete version. But on the other side of things, if we never work on the core of our game, there's going to be another list of problems. We're going to miss out on feedback. We're not going to see our game grow and evolve, which also gives us motivation. And we're probably going to end up with a disjointed mess. Succeeding at the goal of iteration is about learning how to be kind to yourself as a developer by asking this question: what do I want to achieve right now? Anyone who's ever developed a game knows that you're going to be in very different places every time you begin work on the game. At some days, you're going to have a really strong desire to see your game evolve and change into something new and better. In those days, you should channel that into working on the game design. But on other days, you maybe have a fixation on something cool that you saw and you want to try to apply it. Maybe you want to work on the polish of a game. Just because it doesn't need to exist for the core game to exist, it doesn't mean it's always the wrong decision to work on polish. Creating games is a very creative process, and just like any other creative pursuit, you've got to find ways to enjoy the process. And if you're just working on one thing over and over again every day, that might not work for you. But that's okay, the core mechanics are still going to be there. In the meantime, you can learn something new, work on something else, rediscover why you liked working on games in the first place. Making games is a marathon, not a sprint. We have to learn how to be kind to ourselves. The goal of iteration really does center around that. In summary, to achieve the goal of iteration, you first have to understand how to break down a game into its core elements. Once you do that, then you can work on being kind to yourself as a developer so that you can actually create an iteration in a way that doesn't burn you out. There's still two more ways of thinking about design that can help you sustain motivation. Let's look at feedback next. The goal of feedback and reflection is concerned with when to pause the creation process to reflect on your game and how to seek the most valuable feedback. Game developers that sustain motivation understand that even as a solo developer, you don't have to do everything completely alone. Because done well, feedback and reflection can make your game feel as exciting as a brand new project and give you the boost you need to keep going. So when and how do we seek feedback? The most common advice you'll hear is to seek feedback between versions of your game. And although those are great times to seek feedback, there are some major problems with those being the only times that feedback is collected. First of all, feedback taken from an entire version of a game is going to be very broad. Sometimes that's good, but it's more often the case that more targeted feedback is much more useful for a game developer. And secondly, when feedback is spread out this much, it's much harder not to lose touch with the experience of the player. As developers, we experience our games completely differently than a player would. I'm sure many of you watching have created a game, shared it with some people, and found that everyone said it was way too hard to beat and maybe even confusing. That's why frequent feedback is really important. It keeps touch with the experience of the player. When I was researching design strategies, I came across a paper that identified the triggers for iteration in instructional design. A link to that article, as well as an important source they used, will be in the description. The triggers that they identified, along with some that I added of my own, will serve as a great guideline to see when should we pause creation, reflect, and see if we should collect feedback. First, discovery of errors. In this case, you realize that something about your game is fundamentally flawed. If you keep creating at this point, you'll only dig yourself deeper. When this trigger arises, we pause and think, how can I do things differently? If you can't come up with any ideas, then you can seek feedback. Maybe other people have some pretty good ideas. Maybe you have more than one idea and you're not sure where to go. You can seek feedback to see what the player might think and get a deeper understanding of the choices before you. And you can do this even better if you create a scene that highlights the error that you discovered. Then it makes it really clear to the people you're getting feedback from. They'll give much better feedback in that case. So instead of getting discouraged by this big error that's really hampering the game, feedback can be used to revitalize the project, give it a new beginning. The process of getting ideas from people and improving on your game, for me at least, has been some of the most motivating times during my development. Next, identification of improvements. This is the most common scenario in game development. In this case, you just had an idea that you think will improve your game design. The reflection process involves trying to figure out how this could impact your game as a whole. If you're not sure just from reflection, maybe you could get feedback, create versions that implement this new feature in different contexts, and see how people react to it. Next, let's talk about the realization of unrealistic expectations. In this case, you realize the game that you're trying to make is way harder to make than you thought, and you want to reduce the scope in some way. After reflecting about the core elements of the game that you want to keep in place, maybe you'll also want to get feedback to see what is the best parts of the game from an outside perspective. I plan to make more videos on feedback and reflection in the future, but for now, I hope that these triggers that I showed will serve as a good guideline for when to pause creation and reflect, and maybe even get feedback. Here's a summary of how to achieve the goal of feedback and reflection. First, feedback should be collected between full versions of your game, so you can get a general idea of how things are going. Second, reflection should also take place throughout development, so you can get more targeted information and not lose touch with players. Can you think of any other reflection triggers? Feel free to put them in the comments. I'm always looking to improve upon these ideas. Next, let's talk about organization. The goal of organization is concerned with our ability to keep track of tasks that we want to complete. It's pretty easy to see how this is difficult for game developers. Games are so complex, you could spend entire days just writing all the tasks you want to complete. This leads to over-planning being a huge problem for solo devs, and even small teams too. But a lack of planning can do even more harm. So how do we decide what the good balance is? Well, before anything else, we maintain awareness of the effectiveness of our planning. Planning should give us more motivation to work on our projects, not less. And if your planning is holding you back, it's not working. Simple as that. The problem comes when people realize that their planning isn't working and then they completely give up on planning. That can do a lot more harm. Developers that sustain motivation actually enhance their process through planning, and they do it with one simple idea. The only necessary plan is a plan that focuses on what are you going to do next. This allows you to pick and choose what other plans are important to your project. When you care about what you're planning, it's going to do great things for motivation. Do you really need in some document somewhere the statement that your game is going to have a final cutscene? Maybe that makes you feel better to have a general plan. In that case, go for it. But the best plans take the most inspiring parts of your game and dig deeper into them. Last year, I created a game about a spider, and I was working on the storybook lines. Each line that I wrote would fill me with inspiration, so many images in my head. It gave me a clearer idea of what I wanted my game to be. Plans should be like that. They should give you more motivation to work, more inspiration, and a clearer idea of what you're trying to achieve. As a general guideline, only do long-term plans if they're meaningful to you, if they give you inspiration, and more idea about the experience you're trying to create with your game. And don't worry, I'm not saying you shouldn't make a general guideline of the key things that you should have in your game. What I am saying is, you already know that certain things are going to exist in your game. You know there's going to be a final cutscene. You know there's going to be levels. Planning in game dev isn't about figuring out all the pieces to put them together. It's about figuring out which pieces are most important to you and digging deeper into them. With this reframing of plans in game development, I hope that you're much closer to figuring out what kinds of plans work for you. In the description, there's an infographic that you can download for free. Take a look at it when you're feeling unmotivated. What from that list can you use to make the path that you take better and increase your motivation? First, break your game into two pieces: the core game design and the polish. Then, when you're planning your next steps, you can decide, what do I want to achieve? Do I want to see my game grow and evolve into something new? Or do I want to improve something about it? Second, reflect on your game between versions and during development when reflection triggers arise. Use these reflections to decide if you want to get feedback and how much effort you want to put into getting the best feedback possible. Don't do solo development completely alone. Third, prioritize the next steps in your planning and only make long-term plans when they're important to you and your project. Do you want to see me dig deeper into any one of these goals? Do you have another topic that you want me to go over? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the video, well, you know the rest.